All right, our guest today is Professor Martha S. Jones. She is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and the Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She's also the president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, the oldest and largest association of women historians in the United States. And she sits on the executive board of the Organization of American Historians. Her previous books have included Birthright Citizens and All Bound Up Together. She's also written for the Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, and many, many more other great periodicals and publications. But the book that we're going to be discussing today is Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. So, without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to kick off the conversation here with Professor Jones. Professor Jones, it's absolutely fantastic to have you here on the program. Welcome to Book Breaks.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here.
All right, so I was super duper lucky because since I'm hosting the program, I got kind of a treat to read the book because it's only coming out on September 8th. So this is our first book that hasn't yet been published that's being featured on Book Breaks, which is super duper exciting. But I got the chance to read it, and it is an incredible history. This is a big, big history, and it's so dynamic, the energy that comes off the pages. And with every historian that comes on Book Breaks, I love to ask, what inspired the book, and why did you feel it was so important to write this book?
First, let me just say thank you very much to you and to everybody at Gilder-Lehrman for inviting me here. I have been a beneficiary of research support from Gilder-Lehrman. I, for many years with Eric Foner, taught a summer teacher seminar on the history of Reconstruction. So I really feel like this is a bit of a homecoming. And so thank you so much for having me. Vanguard was inspired by two things. The first was my awareness that 2020 we would be marking 100 years since the 19th Amendment became part of the US Constitution. The 19th Amendment, oftentimes referred to as the Women's Suffrage Amendment. And I knew that in my field, African American women's history, many of us had been at work really for 3 generations on Black women's political history. But when I mentioned, it in passing, not everyone had gotten to read our books and our articles and really was benefiting from our wonderful research. So Vanguard was my way of contributing to and broadening the conversation that has been generated by this anniversary. I very much wanted to be sure that African American women's political history was part of our commemorations this year. At the same time, it's a book that was in some ways, in the end, inspired by my own family. I realized that I had questions about the women in my family, my grandmother, her mother's mother, all of whom were living in 1920, but somehow had not passed down their stories of the 19th Amendment. They were themselves enslaved women in some cases and the descendants of slaves. And so in many ways, this book was a very personal journey, one that really allowed me to recover some bits of my own family history that I didn't already know about.
And as I mentioned, it's a really big history because it starts already at the end of the 18th century and concludes with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but already kind of starts to take us into today. The title Vanguard, in your introduction, you mentioned why this term was so important. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Vanguard has 2 meanings in this book. You will meet many Black American women who were firsts in business, in journalism, and certainly in politics and more. And so there is very much the sense that we are visiting women who are breaking glass ceilings and path breakers in their own work. But what I came away from visiting these remarkable lives with ultimately was the strong sense that African American women really had been all along leaders, founders. They developed early on in the 19th century a political philosophy that sounds very 21st century, I think, sometimes to our ears, which is to say African American women by the 18 teens and 20s are already working by way of the premise that neither racism or sexism should have any role to play in American politics, right? That politics should be open to people regardless of race, regardless of gender. And while that sounds 21st century, it turns out for Black women, that's a very old idea, and it's a very old principle. And it's one, I think, that Black women hold on to and work through and promote for a very long time without much in the way of allies, frankly. But today, I think we recognize that for a very long time, Black women had been pointing us towards some of our best ideals, ideals that we are trying to actively live by today. And so I call them Vanguard, in the spirit of folks who really were, for a very long time, have led this country to its best ideals.
And the list of people that you talk about in the book, these are absolutely amazing women. And I hope we can get to as many as possible in our conversation. But one of the themes that I found really fascinating in the book was the connection between Black churches and women gaining their voice, and this already going all the way back to the 1820s. So I was hoping you could maybe start the conversation off with that early 19th century as women are trying to find their voice, even just as preachers, such as such figures as, and I hope I say her name correctly, Jorenna Lee. And if you can talk about some of these amazing women.
Yeah, I think some readers will be surprised to find that one of the places that Vanguard begins is in church, specifically in Black Methodist churches in the first decades of the 19th century. Why? Well, it turns out church is one of the important institutions in a broad sense, but it is a keen site for appreciating the ways in which Black women are beginning to both think through their status and to challenge, frankly, their subordination to men. And Jorenna Lee is an itinerant preacher, a good one, who cannot, for the early part of her career, get a license to preach because the norms and the laws of her church provide that only men have licenses, only men can interpret the Bible. And so she engages on a personal quest, which she recounts in a memoir she writes in 1836. But by 1848, which is of course a fabled year in American women's rights history, because that's the year that in the month of July, there is a fateful meeting in Seneca Falls, New York. But even before the Seneca Falls meeting, in May of 1848, Black women organize in Philadelphia. They arrive at the General Conference, which is the every 4-year confab of Black Methodists, and they've come with an agenda. They've come with a petition, and they are going to seek, insist, get their way to the floor of this convention with the help of some male allies, and they're going to demand and they're going to win preaching licenses. And so here I wanted to demonstrate the many starting places for African American women's activism when it comes to political rights. As we'll, I'm sure, talk about, this is a book that draws our attention, in a sense, away from the suffrage, the much studied and much celebrated suffrage associations, to follow Black women where they were, to listen to them there. And lo and behold, we discover they are there talking about rights, organizing to win them. And it turns out that throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century, in the modern civil rights era, the church is one of those places where Black women are really making their politics.
And these women, they're organizing and they're speaking out, but they're facing this two-pronged sexism and racism simultaneously, but also there is a violent reaction at times. Could you talk a little bit more about the incident that happened in Pennsylvania Hall in May 1838?
Sure. American women, by the end of the 1830s, convene their own national women's anti-slavery conventions, and the first in 1837 and the second in 1838. These are remarkable gatherings for many reasons, right? For many American women, this is a kind of political coming of age. No longer are they on the sidelines in the American Anti-Slavery Society, and instead they are going to convene their own gatherings, make their own speeches, run their own deliberations. It's a remarkable moment. The second of those meetings, also in the city of Philadelphia, is much anticipated by those who oppose many things, including the prospect of women in politics. And so this meeting that will include both Black and white women in the leadership and in the rank and file will be set upon by mobs that harass and work to disrupt the meetings. Tensions are so high that the mayor is drawn into the deliberations about how to address the mobs. And the suggestion he makes tells us a lot about how difficult it is for Black women to be part of anti-slavery politics. Because what the mayor says, in essence, is, you know, if the Black women would simply stay home, that might be enough to quell the crowd, right? That might be enough to settle down the mob. And we learned, of course, that there's a lot that's provocative in those meetings, but what is extraordinarily provocative are African-American women in public, in politics, speaking, deliberating, meeting with white women. To their credit, the leaders of the convention do not give in to the mayor. But what they get in return, if you will, is an evening in which the speeches are canceled, but the mob descends on Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia, where they had been gathering during the day. They torch the hall, and then they move into the city of Philadelphia, but not just to any part of the city. They move into the African-American community and continue to target Black institutions. So I wanted to tell that story as a way of underscoring how dangerous women's political work was in the early 19th century, particularly anti-slavery work, but how Black women were especially targeted by the kinds of violence that these conventions provoked. From the earliest, Black women really put themselves, not figuratively, but their bodies literally on the front lines in political movements of all sorts. There is a great deal at stake for Black women in the cause of anti-slavery, but there's a great deal that they risk when they come out publicly to support it.
And they remained unstoppable. And in the book, you can sense the growing momentum going into the 1850s, the role that these women played in the Civil War and Reconstruction. Can you talk a little bit more about those few couple of decades?
Sure. Black women will be parts of many good causes, as we might say, toward the end of the antebellum decades. They will be among abolitionists. They will join the now National Women's Rights Conventions that begin in 1850. They are part of the Colored Convention movement, what was called the Colored Convention movement in those years. These are African-American political gatherings where there are debates and deliberations and strategizing going on. So Black women are in all these places while they are founding newspapers, on the lecture circuit and more. You're right that there is a kind of burgeoning and together a kind of noise that Black women are beginning to make in American politics. And the Civil War will galvanize many of them some who will recruit Black soldiers to the Union, many thousands of others of whom will raise funds and collect goods to aid both soldiers and refugees when the federal government, the Army, does not attend to the needs of Black soldiers and refugees. And that is a turning point for Black women because they are now stitched together. Their benevolent work is stitched together in what are becoming national networks. There's no way to downplay the significance of the war, the significance of slavery's abolition, of the 14th Amendment, its birthright citizenship and guarantee of equal protection and due process. There's no way to discount the significance of the 15th Amendment, which looks to shore up the voting rights of African-American men. And Black women are very much a part of these scenes, parts of these debates. They understand the tremendous opening possibility, the promise even of Reconstruction, and will be nearly anywhere we look. I wrote this book because too often we write those histories as if Black women weren't there. So I do bring us back to some iconic scenes to foreground and to point out the unique role that Black women are playing, because of course they are grappling with a legacy now of criticism that looks to use their political influence to both defeat racism and sexism. But of course, they are not, well, let's say it is tough to win allies to that position, even after the Civil War.
And in the latter half of the 19th century, it seems the work almost became more difficult in some ways. But can you talk a little bit more about the work of Mary Church Terrell and Eliza Ann Gardner and the National Association of Colored Women being formed at the end of the 19th century?
Yes. So here we are in the 1890s, and parallel to the work of Black women, of course, is the remaking of the women's suffrage movement under the auspices of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Some Black women will affiliate with NAWSA, but most Black activist women, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands by the time we get to the First World War, come together under the new umbrella of the National Association of Colored Women. And you've invoked the names of two, Eliza Ann Gardner and Mary Church Terrell, who are among the founders of that organization. They come by very different routes, and that is part of the story of Vanguard. Eliza Ann Gardner is a Black Methodist woman from Boston who has spent her life working inside and for the AME Zion Church, one of the Black Methodist sects. Gardner has waged a mighty campaign in her church for women's power. They get preaching licenses. They control missionary societies and the money they raise. They get the office of the deaconess, an independent status for women with authority in the church. They even get ordained to the ministry in these years. And Eliza Ann Gardner comes out of that tradition into the founding of now this National Black Women's Political Organization. Mary Church Terrell, born in Tennessee, educated at Oberlin College, a school teacher in a high school teacher in Washington, D.C., an education activist who is the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, and a staunch suffragist, a great admirer of Susan Anthony in particular. Terrell is someone who does not come particularly out of the church tradition, but she is very much a political creature, and interestingly maintains awkward but important alliances with white suffragists throughout her career. And these are the sorts of women who will steer Black women into the 20th century along the road to the 19th Amendment and beyond, but they don't have one story or one sort of cookie cutter beginning at all. What's remarkable is the ways in which they come out of very different histories, very different roads to political consciousness, and yet they find a shared home in the NACW in the 1890s.
And you just mentioned the 19th Amendment. It's the centenary of its ratification this year. But as with the amendments in Reconstruction, the 19th Amendment was also in some ways bittersweet, but Black women still didn't let this stop them, as it was a great success. It finally opened up some doors to them, but they were still being held behind by Jim Crow and poll tax and voter suppression. But they also organized themselves in places like St. Louis with the Citizens League. Can you talk a little bit more about how women, they embraced the right to vote with full gusto?
Absolutely. You know, the 19th Amendment, Black women know, will leave too many of them disenfranchised. That the 19th Amendment, by design, does not interfere with state level laws that had kept Black men from the polls for decades, and now promise to keep Black women also disenfranchised. And so citizenship schools, suffrage schools are spring up out of Black women's clubs, out of their YWCAs, out of their sororities and alumni associations, out of their churches. And there's a lot to learn. How do you pay a poll tax? What is a literacy test? Can I pass it? Do I read well enough to pass it? What is an understanding clause? What do I need to know about the Constitution in order to face down a registrar who's going to try and trip me up about the Electoral College or one of the more complex provisions of the Constitution, or the 14th Amendment, frankly, very complex. So Black women know that they're going to face these obstacles, and so their work is to organize and get as many of them as possible registered despite Jim Crow. It leads to a patchwork of voting rights after 1920 for Black American women. If you live in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco, you've been voting even before 1920 because women's suffrage has come to your state. But particularly for Black women in the South, women's suffrage is brand new in 1920, and not everyone, too many Black women will be kept away from the polls by law, and also, of course, by intimidation and violence. And thus, 1920 marks not the end of the suffrage movement for Black women. It marks a new beginning, frankly, because now they must regroup and refashion their allies and move forward. The NASA and the National Women's Party fold up. They don't respond to Black women's entreaties that they would ally with them long enough to get federal legislation, for example, that would override state Jim Crow laws. That doesn't happen. So Black women ally themselves with African American men and organize on a long and arduous, very dangerous road that will ultimately take them to the passage of the the Voting Rights Act in 1965, 45 years later.
And by the 30s and going in with the Depression and the New Deal era, Some of these women are starting to achieve some leadership positions. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and specifically Mary McLeod Bethune?
Yes. Um, it was really incredible to Mary McLeod Bethune was someone in my household growing up, was a queen. My grandparents had known Mrs. Bethune, and she was a legend. So it was really an honor to be able to spend time in her papers and in the excellent scholarship on her life, to discover that while she had in 1919, 1920, in the state of Florida. She lived in Daytona, Florida. She ran a school there, still there, Bethune-Cookman University. She organized Black women to vote in Florida, but it was a nearly unspeakably violent season, the fall of 1920 in Florida. And Mrs. Bethune is not alone, but she in particular is singled out by the Ku Klux Klan. They visit her school more than once in the 1920s to intimidate her students and faculty, and the Black Americans in Daytona. And this is happening across the state, unfortunately. Mrs. Bethune, by the 30s, comes to Washington, D.C. She founds a new organization, the National Council of Negro Women, and she establishes a rapport with President Franklin Roosevelt. And here, Mrs. Bethune teaches us something. You know, there's more than one way to win political power. Yes, women in her state, Black women in her state, cannot by and large vote by law and by the consequence of violence. But if you can build an allyship with the President of the United States, you can help him build what comes to be called a Black cabinet. And these are African Americans from across the country who come to enjoy power in Washington without ever having appeared on a ballot, because that for too many is not possible. But Mrs. Bethune understands that the president has a great deal of discretion, especially with the advent of New Deal agencies, where a great deal of federal power has now been ceded to places that are run purely by appointment, and not by the ballot box. She brings not only herself, but many African American women into those New Deal agencies precisely so that they can do an end run around Congress and make sure that resources are coming to Black communities that are struggling to get out of the Depression. She's a genius. She befriends Mrs. Roosevelt, and Google them and you'll find that they were frequently photographed together very intentionally. A prominent African-American woman, a prominent white American woman. It was their way of making a statement against Jim Crow in a subtle but very effective way. And Mrs. Bethune will live a long life, long enough such that she's one of the very few African-American delegates at the founding of the United Nations in 1945. But her career really teaches us that Black women don't wait for the vote. They work toward voting rights, yes, but they also make politics in many other sorts of ways. And again, we won't appreciate the fullness of their political power if we keep looking for them at the ballot box, even, because in these difficult decades after 1920, Mrs. Bethune is doing it in a very different fashion.
And you conclude the book with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but there's also these other amazing women. I just want to mention some of the names, of course, Rosa Parks, Diane Nash, Patricia Roberts Harris. But this particularly Polly Murray stands out she has an amazing career. Can you talk a little bit more about her?
I loved writing about Polly Murray, who has been importantly treated by many historians, including Rosalind Rosenberg, who most recently published a book-length biography of Murray. It's funny, you're asking about people. Murray also in my family was a legend, and someone my own grandmother, who was a North Carolinian, like Murray, collaborated with in the early civil rights years. But Murray, interestingly, begins her life a sort of skeptic about the vote. she's not convinced in the 1940s, for example, that Black Americans are going to ever get a fair shot at political power by way of voting rights. The deck seems so stacked against them. She writes about her first votes with a kind of young person cynicism about the process. She votes for dissident candidates who have no shot at winning, rather than sort of dive into party politics as they were fashioned in her young life. But she has a political awakening of her own when she is Jim Crowed on a bus traveling home to visit with her family for the holidays, traveling with a friend. Two young women who are sent to the back of an interstate bus, who object and find themselves in a tussle with a bus driver. This is the sort of story that so many of the women in Vanguard tell, about a political awakening that happens when the wrong person puts their hands on them, literally, and they feel the force of Jim Crow, the force of inequality. In that way, they are not regarded as ladies with a kind of deference or a kind of regard of that sort at all. So Murray is awakened. She attends Howard Law School. She's one of the few women in her class. She finds refuge in a girls' dorm where she becomes a kind of mentor to undergraduates, and there she will work with some of the remarkable women in Washington who are at Howard University during the Second World War, who are leading the sit-ins and desegregating lunch counters and the like in the city there. What I really was moved by in Murray's story is that she never stops inventing herself and discovering who she is. And so she ends her public life, her professional life, ordained as an Episcopal priest. One of the first of women to be ordained as an Episcopal priest. Well, for someone like me who has started our story at the beginning of the 19th century with Jarena Lee, who was looking for that preaching license, if you wondered why that was an important thread, Pauli Murray answers that, right? Because what Murray says is, and I'm paraphrasing her here, but what she says is that, her ordination, in a sense, permitted her race, her gender, her sexuality, all those sort of man-made differences to fall away, finally. That she had lived a life combating so much of that, and yet it wasn't until she was ordained. And I couldn't help think of Jarena Lee, right? Penning a memoir in 1836 and, railing against the sexism to which she was subjected when she preached. I think Pauli Murray was an inheritor, right, of Jarena Lee's struggles, and very much embodied the kind of human principle that many Black women espouse, right? That we are, as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper says in 1866, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And for Pauli Murray, that becomes, I think, just so vividly evident at the moment she's ordained, and she speaks about that.
Well, I would like to keep talking, but I'm going to only ask you one more question because we want to get to the audience questions.
These are great.
But in the conclusion, you said, the story of Vanguard is still being written. It's still happening today. Can you talk a little bit more about that in the context that's happening today all around us? And also because most of our audience are teachers, how they can help bring this to their students, because a lot of this history seems to be sidelined or altogether missing in many of the textbooks. So how can teachers bring these important people from history to their students?
I wrote this book because I wanted us to be well equipped to understand the African American women political leaders in our own time and the history out of which they come. They come out of many histories, but too little of it is that history of Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Alice Paul. Black women invoke a different set of sheroes when they speak about their political lives. Perhaps some of you, and I appreciate that this may be a fraught suggestion in some districts, but if you had the chance to teach a bit of Senator Kamala Harris's acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention just a few nights ago, there's a line there. She invokes women like Mary Church Terrell, Mary McLeod Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Diane Nash, Constance Baker Motley, and Shirley Chisholm. That, I think, is certainly Senator Harris's lesson to us, right? Which is to say, I come out of a political tradition. Let me tell you what it is and who embodied it. And I think it's a teaching moment, right? To say to our students, now if we want to understand Senator Harris, she's kind of an interesting, intriguing, and perhaps consequential figure. Let's ask ourselves, how did she get here? Who inspired her? Out of what political tradition does she come? And she's given you these examples. We've talked about Terrell and Bethune, and then there are Fannie Lou Hamer and Diane Nash from the modern civil rights era, Constance Baker Motley and Shirley Chisholm, women of politics after the passage of the Voting Rights Act and modern politics. I think this is my way to approach this. And the reason that I use biography so centrally in Vanguard was because, well, I certainly didn't know what Senator Harris would say at that podium, be sure. I didn't even know she'd be standing there, but I did know that there are Black women of consequence, be it at the top of a ticket or running for Congress or organizing to get out the vote and more. And she gives us a wonderful set of six figures who I think we have to know about if we want to understand her and her politics in the 21st century.
Well, Professor Jones, it's been so wonderful speaking with you. I'm going to hand you over to Corette because the questions from the audience are starting to come in.
Superb. Hi, Corette.
Thank you. Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for such an important work. And we have so many questions. We're going to start with a question from Michelle in Miami, Florida. And she would like you to speak about Ida B. Wells' contribution to the voting rights for women of color.
Thank you for bringing up Ida B. Wells, Michelle. William knows that in the acknowledgements to Vanguard, I start with Ida B. Wells, who really for me is I don't think historians are supposed to have heroes exactly, but I confess that Ida Wells, it really is the embodiment of the spirit of this book. Wells is born in Tennessee, has a tough young life, an elder sibling to an orphaned family, a teacher, a journalist who is tragically transformed when in the city of Memphis, her neighbors and a friend, gentlemen in Memphis, are lynched. And Wells is radicalized. She understands now lynching to be the profound injustice and a cover for intimidating and disfranchising African Americans, including Black men. And she has a sharp pen, a sharp mind and a sharp pen, and will embark upon not only a campaign for anti-lynching legislation, but will document lynching and educate the nation about the scourge that was lynching at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. Wells, like many of the women I write about, is never a one note or one issue sort of activist. And so she is also a strong suffragist. She lives in Chicago and there can vote by 1912, 1913, and founds the Alpha Suffrage Club and will sometimes work cooperatively with white suffragists and other times face ridicule and denigration in those collaborations, most notoriously at Alice Paul's 1913 Women's Parade in Washington, D.C., where Wells will be urged to march at the back of the parade, and rather than with the Illinois delegation with whom she had come to Washington. Ida Wells is, I think in many ways, Ida Wells is still with us. She's one of those figures who we hear invoked by, Nicole Hannah-Jones, for example, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist at the New York Times, has worked for a very long time, if you will, under the auspices or the mentorship, the inspiration of Ida Wells. I've had the privilege of working with Ida Wells' great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster, who is an educator and activist in Chicago. So Wells is so important in her own lifetime, but has also been important in our lifetimes because she has continued to inspire and set the bar high for our work in the 21st century.
The next question is from Don, who teaches and lives in Syracuse, New York. He would like to know was there any specific story that inspired you profoundly in a personal way? He's aware that you were inspired by many, but was there one particular one that really resounded with you personally?
Yes. We've mentioned Mary Church Terrell, and Mary Church Terrell publishes a memoir in 1940. She lives a long life. She publishes a memoir. So in addition to her papers, which are at the Library of Congress, we also have this memoir. And there she tells a story that was critical for me, and I'll never forget it. Terrell was a student. She traveled, and even as a girl, traveled with her father, who was in business. And they traveled on railroad cars that were segregated, that relegated Black Americans to a smoker car, reserved a ladies' car, principally, oftentimes for white women, etc. And she tells of how frequently she is accosted and assaulted when, despite having bought the right ticket, she looks to sit in the ladies' car. But there's one story. She's really still a girl, and she's traveling with her father, and her father, they get separated. And so she's moving through the car to catch up with her father, and she gets stopped by a conductor who says, gal, you belong in that car and not in this car. And he puts his hands on her. She's a girl. And Terrell has been raised to comport herself with a kind of respectability, right? With a kind of Victorian ladies' comportment of reserve. But when this man puts his hands on her, she reaches for her parasol, a most ladylike implement, and she beats him with it until it breaks. And this was a really important story for me. I will never forget it because it exposed, right, how dangerous travel was for Black women. Why do they need the vote? Because they need ways to push back against this prospect. But also that for all her gentility, Mary Church Terrell could break form and pummel a man with a ladylike instrument if called for. It really told me about sort of the fullness of her humanity. And I think that's part of what I was trying to capture in this book, is that these women are activists and we admire them tremendously, but they're also human beings who are grappling with tough, formidable, sometimes dangerous circumstances. And we don't always know what they'll do, I guess is what I'd say.
And such a brave response.
It is.
The next question is from Sam. He's a teacher from the Boston, Massachusetts area, and he says he's somewhat familiar with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, but he's very interested in the role of African American women in the debate over the 14th and 15th Amendment on both sides of the split, like within the women's movement. The split within the women's movement. He says he does a simulation with students debating the movement and how they should have responded. And he's wondering if there's good sources for additional Black women voices weighing in on the debate.
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning Frances Harper. I've done that simulation too in my classroom, Sam. So I endorse it because I think students, when they revisit the debates in the 1860s over the terms of the 14th and 15th Amendment in that old radical coalition, they discover such a range of viewpoints that story is so often told as if it was simply a face-off between Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who advocates educated suffrage, and Frederick Douglass, who advocates for Black men's votes. There's so much more going on in that meeting, and Frances Harper is so critical to that. You know, the minutes of those meetings, it sounds like you already know about, but Watkins Harper's writings are have been published and compiled, and there's new work about her coming out. You know, she was a poet principally, and I think we don't read her poetry enough. I'm guilty of that. Sojourner Truth is in those meetings, and Truth's speeches, I think, are very much worth returning to. There's another character who I think doesn't get as much attention from these years, but is critical, I think, which is Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Shadd Cary is, by the 1870s, a serious suffragist, but in the 1850s, she's the editor of a newspaper called the Provincial Freeman out of Canada West. She's a dissident refugee to Canada who returns to the US only at the advent of the Civil War. Her newspaper is online, and it's fascinating because it really is a chronicle of the ways in which Black Americans are debating these questions. And then I have to mention the very important Colored Conventions Project, which has compiled the proceedings of the so-called colored conventions of this period. And there you will find these questions also being debated as Black Americans begin to convene again, beginning in 1864, and they will meet locally, regionally, nationally in those years. And the Colored Conventions Project website has those debates. They are searchable, they are printable, they are imminently teachable, and I hope you'll enjoy exploring the materials there.
Right. This next question is from Lois from Oregon. She says, with the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment coming in, she would like to know if there was a state or maybe an organization that was instrumental, that was led by Black women, that was instrumental in getting the women's constitutional right to vote.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Lois. You know, being from Oregon, that women in the West, including Black women, are already voting in many places. And the ratification of the amendment is not controversial there, but it is also doesn't constitute enough states in order to arrive at 36. And historian Elaine Weiss has told with great effect the drama that goes on in the state of Tennessee around ratification there. Tennessee is a southern state, and what does that mean? It means that African American women are not encouraged, not included, are kept at a deliberate distance from the ratification debates, precisely because what is persuasive to Tennessee's lawmakers about the 19th Amendment is that Black women will not win the vote. It would undercut the prospect of ratification in a southern state to have African American women visible, active, in the leadership in this moment. This is the bargain that suffragists strike as ratification of the amendment approaches. That's a tough part of the story.
This question is from Mark from Vanguard High School in New York City. He says, since it won't be practical for him to teach the whole book this year, and he doesn't really have his copy yet, where in the book he is asking, do you think he would find the most powerful evidence of women of color disrupting the traditional narrative about women's political power in America? He says disrupting this narrative is a major priority for them this year.
Thank you, Mark. And I love the name of that high school. I'd love to know more of the story behind it. I very much include kind of key moments. So one of them is 1848 and Seneca Falls, and we've talked a little bit about that, right? Teach Seneca Falls and then ask, where were Black women? And you will find them in Philadelphia in the AME Church Conference, doing their own version of women's rights work at the same moment around the same questions that are animating Seneca Falls. That's one approach you might take. You might teach ratification of the 19th Amendment, I don't know, but the portion of the book there looks closely at what Black women are doing, since, as we've discussed, they are not intimately a part of the ratification dynamics. Where are they? What are they doing? Citizenship schools, suffrage schools, the attempt to win the support of Alice Paul for an ongoing suffrage movement that fails. I hope there are places in the book like that that help you to, as I have tried to tell the story from the perspective of Black women. The 1913 Women's Parade I highlight. So these are moments that might fit into your teaching, but I try to narrate them from a different vantage point.
Okay, this is a great question. Vaughn asks, I think Vaughn, I'm maybe mispronouncing it. Black women are a political force to be reckoned with, as was evidenced by the rise of Joe Biden, spurred by the South Carolina primaries. These women are often displayed through the lens of sororities and other privileged Black associations. Will you comment on the intersection of race, gender, and class as it pertains to Black women's influence in winning voting rights?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a statistic that I think opens a really important door to a critical thinking about an organization like the National Association of Colored Women. And the statistic is this: on the eve of the First World War, the NACW has 300,000 members. 300,000 members. I share that to say that is not an organization membered by the elite at all. That those numbers, I think, require us to recognize that most of the women we associate, the Black women we associate with that organization, with anti-lynching activism, with women's suffrage activism, and a great deal more, are working women in the United States. They are not privileged women at all. Very few of the women I write about are at leisure to be full-time activists. And so they are not only themselves working women, they work to be, I think, attuned with the concerns of working women. But I think to be more direct, there's no question that this is a book that foregrounds, in a sense, how someone like Mary McLeod Bethune or Fannie Lou Hamer, a Sojourner Truth, right? A kind of journey that some Black women take, not to an elite place, because their lives are hardly privileged in the way I think we oftentimes mean that term. But yes, these are women who work their way to leadership, to some of them independence, financial and political. And that is absolutely part of the story that I tell.
All right, so this question will be the final question because of time. And this question is from Kristen. She says, Mary Elaine Bethune was well known in your home. How do we get that story and other stories in our students' home? Do you have any suggestions for other books for young adult readers? And
yes,
we ordered your book.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And there are some wonderful YA books that are out now. One by Yvette Dion called Lifting as We Climb, which is the motto of the National Association of Colored Women. And then Veronica Chambers and a team at the New York Times have just published a book, and I'm going to apologize because the name I should remember. Don't tell her I didn't remember the name, but it's a beautiful, again, young adult book that looks at a great deal of this history. So part of what's exciting, I think, about this centennial year is that, you know, I had an idea 3 years ago about a book, and so did lots of other folks. And so, and writing it at very different levels. And so I'm very proud of Vanguard. It's a beautiful book, but it's written for you all, less so for young readers. But fortunately, Veronica Chambers, Yvette Dion are among those who have published brand new books on the same topic for different audiences. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Professor Jones.
All right, thank you, Professor Jones, for answering all those fantastic questions and for the fantastic conversation. I'm going to share my screen one more time here. All right. And I just want to let everyone in the audience know, I mentioned it earlier, that we have the MA Master's Program in American History in association with Pace University. This is open to teachers. If you want to find out more, head over to gilderlerman.org. Many of the professors in the courses have already been featured here on book breaks, so you're already going to be familiar with them. Now for Professor Jones's book, Vanguard, it's going to be published on September 8th, but you can already go ahead and pre-order the book. Please go over to bookshop.org, the Gilder Lerman bookshop.org page. You can order the book there. I can't recommend it enough. It is a fantastic book. And when you purchase through bookshop.org, not only do you help support the Gilder Lerman Institute, you also help support independent bookstores as well, which is incredibly important. After we end the meeting here, you're going to be sent a link for a survey. As we ask every week, if you could just take a couple of minutes and fill it out. We love to get your feedback and your comments. And I hope you'll be able to join us next Sunday, August 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Catherine Clinton will be joining us with her book, Stepdaughters of History. And if you're interested in finding out anything else about the Gilder Lerman Institute, all our other fantastic programs and resources, just pop over to gilderlerman.org. Professor Jones, one last time, a big, big thank you for writing this fantastic book and for the great conversation. A big thank you to you, Corette, for corralling all those fantastic questions. And for you out there, our audience, a big thank you to you as well for joining us. And I know some of you have been longtime viewers, so we really appreciate you joining us every week. We're all going to shut our screens off. I'm going to leave this screen up for about 5 minutes or so after we end the program here. You can go ahead and write these links down, but please know that you'll be sent a follow-up email and all those links will be included. So have a great Sunday afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.